So a couple things before we begin. I want to take a look at our syllabus. So this is where we are, Module 6 already, moving along. Today, you read Freud, Creative Writers and Daydreaming, and The Uncanny, and they're the reading responses. Next week, 2 weeks. I won't see you next week. You're on a mini break. Okay. So 2 weeks from today, your midterm papers are going to be due. All right. I'm just going to go over them right now. All right. So here's your midterm. These papers are to be 4 to 6 pages in length in standard formatting. They're due March 18th. Submit them as a PDF on Canvas. I will give you till the end of the day. You may write on a topic of your choosing if you wish, but please discuss your idea with me first. You can simply email me about it or discuss it with me after class. Feel free to ask questions that occur to you while you're writing these. You may email me to set up a meeting anytime on Zoom. It's easy. Of course, it's just as easy to use the writing studio now that's online, and that is their website right there. Just while I'm thinking about it, March 18th, 2 weeks from now, we will meet as a class. You will not have a reading assignment. Your papers will be due. You know, what we take up that day will probably be it will concern whatever loose strings we have today. Okay. I don't imagine we'll get to both Freud essays, or certainly not in completion. Good. All right, so what am I looking for in these papers? 4 criteria. I'm looking for persuasive argumentation. I'm asking you to take a position on a reading of the text, an interpretation of the text, and prove that you are reading carefully. Please support your position by way of supporting arguments and illustrative quotes and references to the book, the text in question. Please do not go overboard with quotes. There is a happy medium. Make sure your position in the paper and all your arguments are clear. This is where a proofreader is invaluable. Correct grammar, that goes without saying, and that's part of clarity. And then insightful comments and critique to take these papers to the next level. Issue insights beyond what we have come up in class discussions. Footnoting. In my classes, I like students to do what is called Chicago-style footnoting. We will not be doing in-text citations here. When you quote, you will footnote your quote. Literally, what that means is you will create a note in the footer of the page, the bottom of the page. MS Word, Google Docs will do this automatically for you. And that's where you will put the bibliographical information relevant to the quote. What I've given you here is the example. This is the proper format for the information in the footnote. If you're to quote Walter Benjamin, by the way, and I think this refers to the Benjamin text I had us all read. I mean, the exact edition. Author, title, book, editor, translator, publisher, city, publisher, year. Now, please note, you only have to give all that information with the first footnote. All subsequent footnotes, you may abbreviate or just simply put Benjamin, page 7. Okay. I'm going to talk, I have a style footnoting sheet, which I'm going to show you next. That will explain a little bit more of this in depth. I have come up with, I put together 4 prompts. If there is something that you are really hell-bent on writing about that is not encapsulated by these prompts, I am open to individual ideas. Just please be in touch with me so we can discuss it, so I know what to expect. but I'll go over these for now. 1, Benjamin favors the revolutionary promise of photography, but then reveals that he thinks film is more revolutionary still. How so? What are the virtues of film in his view, and what is its political promise? In The Origin of Work of Art, Heidegger says the setting of a world and the setting forth of earth are two essential traits belonging to the work being of the art work. Explain. 3, how does Danto analyze 20th century art movements? What revolution was wrought by pop art, and how did earlier 20th century art movements prefigure or anticipate it? 4, Freud says, among other things, animism, magic, and witchcraft, the omnipotence of thoughts are factors which turn something fearful into an uncanny thing. Explain his point and the role of repression in the uncanny. Okay. So, yeah, let me just open up for questions. Anybody have any questions about any of this? Okay. This I'm going to put in student view, because when I put this in student view, you'll see that right here it has submit assignment at the top. Okay. So that's where you'll press that button when it is time for you to submit your paper when it's all done. Any questions at this point? All right. The next thing I wanted to look at with you all is the style and footnoting sheet. I'm just going to hit on some of the main points. I'm not going to go over it. It's like a couple pages I put together for all my classes. And the reason I put this together is because this speaks to issues and concerns and problems that I notice in college and graduate level writing today. Okay, so this is designed for students like you, maybe not you personally, but students like you. Opening up here, I have a little bit of a grid about, a little bit of discussion about plagiarism, what constitutes plagiarism, and how to avoid it. Part and parcel with that is knowing when to cite outside ideas, that is, knowing when to footnote. Everybody knows that you need to footnote quotes. That's known. But it turns out you also have to footnote statistics and figures and data, which I don't imagine will make it into your papers in this class, but also reported facts or events that are not common knowledge. And if you are not clear on what counts as not common knowledge, you can reach out to me and I will settle that issue for you. What I have below this are how to footnote different types of sources. Now, for these first sets of papers, I've written the prompts just pertaining to the texts we've read so far. For your midterms, my goal is pretty simple. I want to make sure that you are doing the authors justice. Okay. I want to make sure that you're paying attention to them and that you are that you're grasping their position accurately and that you're relaying it faithfully. Okay. I don't want students launching preemptively into critique. Please understand first what you will be critical about. So these midterms are an exercise in understanding. Okay. That said, you may bring in outside sources. It's okay. I don't have a problem with it. That will vary. And what I have here is indication how to footnote different types of sources, like a book, an edited book, a translation, an article, an essay in a journal, a newspaper, non-print media too, TV shows, film, and recording, online resources as well. What I've included here under part 3, how to create a footnote in MS Word. This pertains also to how to create a footnote in Google Docs. I am finding more and more that students, when they come out of high school, they are learning to use in-text citations for footnotes, for referencing quotes. And that's not what we're doing in this class. As I told you, we will be doing footnoting. And this is what the footnote looks like. I wrote a little paragraph here. Machiavelli says blah, blah. And when you do it properly, MS Word Google Docs automatically inserts superscript wherever you want it for the quoted material, and then creates a footer, and that's where you put your footnote material. Okay. Now with MS Word, you write your quote, your cursor's at the end of the quote, you leave it there, you go up to insert, click on footnote, and then the cursor automatically pops down here, and MS Word will automatically enumerate your quotes as well. And I believe Google Docs is quite similar. I do not use Google Docs at all. So can anybody tell me, is Google Docs different?
I don't know exactly the right. I mean, it's very very similar. It's pretty straightforward where to find it.
Yeah.
And does like the same thing where there's a line and drops you down into it. Yeah.
I have a feeling it is straightforward. So but again, if you have any questions or issues, please get in touch with me and I'll show you how to do this. It's very important because that you learn to do this now, because for the final research papers, these will involve research. You'll be using outside materials, and footnoting will be very important, and footnoting different types of sources. This indicates how you can footnote multiple sources at once. I've seen something weird where students, they write a quote or a sentence, and then they put one and then two, like two footnotes at the end of a sentence. Don't ever do that. You always only have one footnote at the end of a sentence. Down in the footer, you can have multiple sources. Just put a semicolon. Here's something else that, in case you were not aware how to do this, I've indicated. This is about formatting large quotes, okay? I made up an essay. I plunked a large quote in the middle there. See? The pioneers pushed into the Indian village with a train of horse-drawn carriages, blah, blah, blah. That's a quote. And that's how you indicate it accurately in the English language, right? What do you notice?
It's like indented, like a couple of tabs into the text, and like sits on its own column.
Awesome. Tab is indented twice, and it's like a block form. What else do you notice? I said it's a quote. What's missing?
No quotation marks.
No quotation marks. It's weird, y'all. I don't have an explanation for it. It is the language you have inherited. Deal with it. And then I created footnotes for that. Thank you, Blythe. On a stylistic note, please indicate, introduce your quotes. Benjamin says this, or as Freud argues, right? Don't just drop quotes in without any introduction. Also, students are increasingly unclear how to indicate titles. I don't know why that is, but when you have a book title, you've got to underline it or italicize. Same with the movie title, a newspaper title, or a magazine title, okay? Everything else gets quotation marks. All right, that's all there, basically. Does anybody have any questions? All right, does anybody have any lingering questions about the papers? All right, well, this is now officially recorded. So I will post this on Canvas, and you can reference this later. All right. I promised you Andy Warhol, so I have Andy Warhol. Sorry, I forgot. I got to go back to share again. This is a little interview with him. I don't know if anybody's seen it yet. It's curious. Let me make sure I do have closed captions. So I'm going to show this for a few minutes to just see what you think.
Earlier, you said casually, since I don't believe in painting anymore.
Well, I don't believe in painting because I hate objects, and I hate to go to museums and see pictures of the world because they look so important and they don't really mean anything.
People think of you as the perfect pop artist without really knowing what that means, or I think really knowing what your work is about. I'd like to try to talk some more about the paintings and what you did earlier, because because there's something that I think needs to be explained for, like, which has at this point a certain impression of you, and I'm not sure that it's the one you would want them to have, although I don't think it matters to you very much. Is that true?
What?
Does it matter to you that people feel one way or another to you? I mean, you have a kind of reputation now, which is a little bit apart from what you really are, I think. And does it matter to you that this is so, that they feel one way rather than another about you?
Understand. This is like sitting at the World's Fair, you know, riding one of those Ford machines where the voice is behind you. It's so exciting. You don't have to think anything. But you should just tell me the words and I can just repeat them because I can. It's. I'm so empty today. I can't think of anything. Why don't you just tell me the words and they'll just come out of my mouth?
No, don't worry about it because we
No, I think it'd be so nice.
we'll loosen up after a while.
Well, no, it's not that. It's just I can't really have a cold and I can't
Okay.
think of anything. And it'd be so nice if you told me a sentence. And I
Let me ask you some questions that you can answer.
Oh, no, but you repeat the answers too.
All right. Well, I don't know the answers.
Oh,
Before you started the silkscreen, you made a number of paintings and you made comic strips, right?
I guess I made comic strips before I did the silkscreen things.
Then you made some other paintings of things that were not done mechanically. What was that?
I made, I guess they were ads for magazines.
And then you made,
and then I made
things like,
Japanese
Oh,
food
sorry.
is amazing in that it's so simple. It is made up of so many little dishes.
Okay.
Andy Warhol's reticence about himself masks a unique sensibility, one which has helped to alter our vision of the contemporary world. He suppresses his own feelings. This comes naturally to him, but also it imposes a detachment which gives his work an objective, almost surgical clarity. In time, he arrived at the silkscreen technique of making his pictures, a method which completely removes his own hand from the paintings. Choosing the images, their scale and shape, he sends them off to be processed photomechanically. Only the choice of color remains. In the factory, as everyone calls his studio, he prints the paintings with the help of his assistant, poet Gerard Malanga. Like Lichtenstein, Warhol takes his images from commercial art and from the popular culture, focusing on the most banal and familiar components of our environment. Warhol's intention is not satirical. With an implacable coolness, he forces our attention on the bizarre inventory of package labels, movie stars, and news photos of disasters, things we never really look at. By blowing up their scale, treating them so mechanically and passively, and often monotonously repeating them within the same painting, he rides over our indifference and our blindness. We have no other choice but to open our eyes anew to the whole world around us. A lot of people might be inclined, it seems to me, to put you down because they could say that your work has a certain distance, it's mechanical and you don't really make it and all of those things. And yet, like everyone else, when you start to talk about it, the things you say are about really caring. I mean, you want people's lives to be better.
Yeah, well, I guess I really don't. It's too hard to care, and I guess I care, still care, but I mean, it would be so much nicer not to care.
In other words, are you saying that you are involved in this idea of making people more conscious of their lives, but you don't really want to get into their lives deeply? You just want to stir up.
Oh, yes, yeah. Don't want to get too involved.
I think that this is a very important thing about all of your work. I mean, this idea of the distance, your own distance that you keep from it. Is this because of this feeling that you don't want to get that close to it?
Yes, I don't want to get too close to it.
You never, in any of your work, have ever really said anything that tells anyone anything about you, and you don't want that to happen, do you?
Well, there's not very much to say about, about me.
But there have been some extraordinary things. I think that for me, the high point was the opening of the exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, when so many people came that they had to take all the pictures down, and thousands of people jammed in there, and there were no pictures to speak of, just you. And you had the real character of a celebrity there, the kind of celebrity we really haven't had in American art. Do you realize that?
Oh, it was so great and glamorous.
Well, Andy, do you have any thoughts at all about the fact that so many people like the idea of just being able to watch you sitting in a chair or standing on a balcony signing soup cans?
But that won't last very long.
You don't think so?
No. It was just sitting there. It's really doesn't mean anything. But what I really want to do is, I guess, do some movies and sort of take what we've done, combine them together or something.
Andy Warhol has turned his attention more and more to movies, and he has become a leader.
Okay. So there you have it. That's at least a little blurb. I'd be happy to share that link with you. I was trying to find an interview with him on the Brillo boxes, and I couldn't find that. Anybody have any thoughts, or what are your impressions about that that interview and that excerpt?
That he really didn't want to be at that interview.
Seriously, he made that guy's life hell, huh? Anything else? Any other thoughts or impressions?
I feel like he's just like, it's just like a whole bunch of nothing. Like he doesn't say anything. He just mumbles words together, and it just is like complete incoherent nothingness. But it's kind of interesting how much effort other people go to give him the words and the meaning. And it's kind of this like cultic and like celebrity level of like, how much effort Danto puts into what he's trying to say about Warhol, and how much this interview and just everyone. But actually, it's just a bunch of nothingness. It's kind of interesting.
My favorite part is where he says to the interviewer, "Why don't you give me the sentences to respond to you?" I love that. Right. One thing we did not discuss, because we were fixated on the Brillo boxes, we didn't talk about the factory and his what's it called? Silk screens? Is that right? Silk screen. And the narrator in the video says because he doesn't want to have his hand involved, or what is it? Do you guys know how he put it? He's like, he doesn't want his hand involved in the painting, or he wants to remove his agency.
The artist's hand is usually kind of the phrase, like remove the artist's hand. Yeah.
Thank you. And it occurred to me, so he is, one of the first to talk about a factory for making art. Nowadays we think about Jeff Koons. Doesn't he have a similar factory? I was just wondering that this question occurred to me while I was listening to the interview and watching him. Does he make anything at all? Is Andy Warhol making anything at all? Right? there's a sense in which he's really not. I mean, the silk screen, what was that? That was a famous picture of Marlon Brando, right? It's not even a unique or original picture that he is copying with silk screen. It is a, he's taking things that are, he's just recycling things basically. What do you all
Maybe he's not, maybe it's like I think he's making stuff, but I don't know if he's creating something. And then the difference between making and creating.
Yeah. Of course. That's much better, right? Yeah. And he certainly seems like he would deny to the interviewer that he creates anything, right? What do you think that interview relays about celebrity? It was kind of an interesting exchange towards the end there where he says, the interviewer kind of pins him down. It's like, you're not answering anything, but you're famous and like people just want to see you. And I don't know. I guess this is not something we talked about either. Danto at one point reveals that, one of the things that's remarkable at Andy Warhol is that like there were no limitations on art. He did all kinds of art. He did film as well, famously. But I can't remember if Danto talks about celebrity as one of Andy Warhol's artworks, if you will. Does anybody have thoughts about how celebrity relates to any of this?
I mean, celebrity can be certainly seen as art in the sense of like performance art and like taking on celebrity as a project. I certainly think that's what's happening now with reality stars and such. So, I mean, I think Warhol was obsessed with celebrity and fame. And so I think
It was.
I think potentially that's the only thing he really wanted was to be famous. I think he saw celebrity for what it was in this kind of fake creation of something that people get obsessed with. I think he was aware of that and able to play off that. But I also think, and this is just me reading into it, but I do think he really wanted to be famous.
Good. Thank you. Jay.
So I agree with Babette. It's like there is an artistry to being a celebrity. It's like curating yourself and curating the ability. Like I think this also ties into how he's not creating anything, but he is like appropriating different aspects of culture. So he's appropriating like the kind of curated personality tropes that people have as a celebrity, and like kind of curating and acting himself to be this kind of person in the public image. During this time, though, there is this thing that was like called party kids, where people like clubs actually paid people to come and like party there and bring their entourage. And like Andy wasn't necessarily one of them, but he does hang out with a lot of them because it's like party king. And that actually was a job.
Yeah,
and I think that like he's a smart guy. He probably also knew that not all of the party scene kids were actually their own persona, and maybe he was interested in that, or maybe he wasn't. We're making speculations,
right.
and so I think like film and the ability to be a celebrity and the ability to be a famous person also ties into all of the whole thing of like curation.
Interesting. Awesome. The question that just occurred to me while y'all were talking was, I put in the chat, do you create celebrity? Does one create celebrity? Who creates celebrity?
I feel like we all do. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. No, you go, Jay.
Okay. I do think we all create a celebrity. It's a sort of idolatry almost. Like you have the fanaticism of people who almost worship celebrities to an extent. And I do think that celebrities are created. Like if you think about it, who actually that have you met that like are some of the extreme personality types that some celebrities are? And to a point, like I do think that not only do they create it, but us as a society evaluates and then approves of it, and then that kind of spirals into like that's a spiral, that's a cycle that feeds each other. The
Well,
more people ascribe to that idea and archetype that the person is acting upon, the more they can act upon it. It's like you have the permission to be this person. The acknowledgement of the masses like give them the ability to continue being a celebrity.
thank you. I specified my question. What I was really asking, what kind of role does the celebrity play in creating celebrity? That's really it. But you got to that, Jay. Babette?
I was gonna say I think Donald Trump and Andy Warhol are very similar. Um,
Oh boy.
well, one, just like hearing that interview, it was like, you know, the way he was talking is like very much the way Trump talks, in which there's a lot of words that with and like fragments, and we all have done a lot of work to fill in those fragments and kind of like add in and interpret and try to guess what's going to happen and guess why he was responding in a certain way. And I also think that he is the classic person of celebrity creating celebrity.
Yeah.
I mean, he definitely manifested an entire brand, an entire world, an entire belief system. You know, he has a cult following. It's, you know, I think he has crafted what is celebrity and also kind of brought it to its highest peak in some ways. And he is a little bit of a void in the way Andy Warhol is, that we fill a lot into it. And his kind of, again, my assumption of Donald Trump is that he just wants to be famous. So it's not really how and why, it's just that. And we all do the work to get him there, similar to Andy.
Good. Anybody else? I think the word you were searching for, Babette, is we project onto the celebrity. And I feel like that's a major part of what Andy Warhol is up to. That's why what he's revealing, you know, is that the celebrity, and he's kind of the epitome of this as a celebrity, he's kind of empty, right? There's nothing there, you know. We project celebrity onto him, and he's kind of revealed this and pointed that out. He's pointing that out. You know, what does it mean? You know, at fame as a good in itself. By the way, I read this quote about Donald Trump in the last month or so. He is so smitten now with politics. He said he couldn't really go back to business, and the quote was something like, or he couldn't go back to real estate business. And the quote was like, I can't go back to picking out windows for my hotels. He says, now that I've been in, you know, driving limousines with crowds adoring me, like that's what I need that now, you know. And as the Greek philosophers have pointed out forever, like fame is a very strange kind of end or goal. It's the emptiest of them all. I mean, what is it to be famous? It is to be known. That's it, you know. And the opinions of, as Aristotle puts it, it's the most difficult goal of all, the most frustrating goal of all, because you cannot, because you don't have control about how people, their opinions of you, right? That's fleeting and potentially, you know, fluctuating quickly. So, you know, it is an empty gain. And I wonder to what extent Warhol is saying the same thing about brands. I mean, Campbell sucks, right? I'm not a fan of Coke either. And, you know, actors, I guess, are brands as well in a way. And at their core, they're kind of empty. The brand is what we project onto them, you know. Have we talked about Naomi Klein in this class? Did that come up? I recommend this book to all my students whenever it comes up, especially if you're in graphic design illustration. Naomi Klein, she is now she's known to be like a very aggressive environmental activist, and she writes for The Nation. But she started out as a critic of globalization back in the 90s. And she wrote a book called No Logo, which is like a masterful work that covers the history of branding and links it with the trend of globalization. And she points out, for example, she says in the opening page, like, what does Gap make? The Gap, right? And people initially say the Gap makes clothes. And she points out the Gap doesn't make clothes. They outsource everything. They make a brand, they make a feeling. What does Nike make? People will say Nike makes shoes. Nike doesn't make a single goddamn shoe. It's all outsourced. Everything in-house in their Nike headquarters in Oregon is devoted to advertising and marketing. They're all about creating a brand, which is essentially a spirit, right? And they have that motto, just do it. And that captures people. And so people equate that motto with the brand, right? So in that vein, I don't know what Campbell's motto is, and I'm not sure what their branding is, but maybe it's like feeling nostalgic for home and chicken soup on a cold day, and mom gives you a cup, things like that, right? Even though it's salty as hell, and I would recommend you eat it. Anyway, nice. Oh, Blythe, you have an interesting comment in the chat here. I don't know Carrie Lambert Beatty. Would you say a word about that, please?
Yeah, she wrote a paper on this idea of parafiction and the parafictional persona, the idea of like an artist curating your persona and work surrounding like creating something that's like between truth and fiction.
Wow.
It's really interesting. I kind of like the paper. Yeah.
Did she reference Andy Warhol?
No, I just was thinking about we were talking about like what does it mean to like create a celebrity, and like from like her paper, this artist Amalia Ullman like created a whole series about creating a celebrity persona under parafiction.
And when Amalia Ullman, when did this artist work? Is this artist still working now?
Yeah, she just released a film, but before that, like it was all like through Instagram. The project is like a performance piece. She curated like the stages this person was going to go through, and like took photos of this person's like mental state throughout like a period of time. I think it was like 2014.
Interesting. That sounds very similar to what Andy Warhol is up to, as far as I can tell. Good. Anybody else want to weigh in on Andy? I recently saw a documentary about Studio 54. I don't know if you guys ever heard of Studio 54? That was the big nightclub at the end of the 70s. And Warhol would go, and Truman Capote, who was an author, Bianca Jagger, I don't know, a couple others, and they would go to be seen. You know, it was all about being seen. Oh, thank you, Blythe. That's great. If anybody's interested.
Andy also created the Interview magazine, which is still pretty prolific today.
God,
Yeah.
I haven't seen it in years. Okay.
Yeah. So, and that, I mean, that was largely focused on the idea of interviewing celebrities.
Hilarious. He's the worst interviewer of all.
Right.
Where does he get
And
off?
he just projects away from himself, and then
Yep.
we project onto him, and it's just like this exchange. So makes sense. But
He-
That's still a pretty highly functioning, highly like, you know, sought after. Like, I feel like when people get put in Interview magazine, it's considered kind of like the mix between celebrity and art, like that
Yep.
blend between those two worlds.
It used to be. I remember in the 80s, it was huge. I didn't realize it was still around. That's interesting. Yeah, it's funny. Rosemary points out, that he's deflecting, but the funny thing, he's not deflecting very hard, right? He's still attracting somehow, right? The deflecting is disingenuous. Even in the interview there, the way he holds himself and the way he speaks is still allure. He knows there's something alluring there. He doesn't look like any ordinary 1950s gentleman, for sure. Anyway, good. All right. So if I see any other interesting interviews with Andy Warhol, I'll send them your way that I think illustrate what Danto is talking about. Andy Warhol is, I would describe him as a highly postmodern artist, a highly postmodern individual, for the reasons we've been discussing. He problematizes the very idea of the artist as creator, and art as creation, certainly as unique creation. And he problematizes the idea of the artist as any kind of person at all, as if they're, as we discussed, like there's no one there, there's nothing there. Is he just a mirror? Right? His in-house band at the factory was Velvet Underground, and Velvet Underground has that famous song, I'll Be Your Mirror. I wonder if that was inspired by Andy. I was also thinking about Benjamin while I was watching that video. And I leave that to you for further consideration, But Benjamin worrying about art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And then there's Andy erected a factory to make art that bears very little unique creation at all, right? What would Andy have to say about aura? That's a good one. All right. Anybody want to say anything else about, or any questions about Andy? Anything there? All right, good. Let's talk about Freud. So for today, I had you read the essay, The Uncanny. And I should tell you off the bat, this is the first time I've taught this essay. I have taught a lot of Freud in my past, so I'll be bringing up references to the rest of his corpus, but this piece in particular is new to me. How did this read for you all? How was it? Anybody want to share their general impressions? Was this your first time reading Freud? Okay. All right. Anybody want to share their impressions, general impressions? Did this read easily? Well? Did you like it? Or not? All right, let the floodgates open.
Well, my sister and I've had to deal with a lot of Freud in our life because our mom is a psychoanalyst.
Oh,
So we're like
Obsessed.
overly familiar to a point of annoyance. So it's like we're very tainted over here, but
Extremely biased.
extremely biased. But however, I would say his writing is similar to Danto's, and kind of it's like so like outrageous, like ego, and kind of statements of like discovery of exploring a topic that has been completely overlooked, but he'll take the time aside to unpack a topic that has, I love how he introduces in being like, you know, I really shouldn't be delving into these things because I really focus on other stuff. But I am going to delve into this because it's been largely underlooked and like, you know, but yeah, I mean, aside from the like incredibly like gender issues with his overall gender bias, you know, I think he has always written in a way that's it's pretty easy to comprehend what he's writing. I don't think I really, you know, I'm just not a fan.
No
of him
worries.
in general. And like the castration complex and this obsession with the womb, and you know, these are things that are just like annoyingly kind of implemented now into our like psyches. And we're so obsessed with Freud as kind of this basis of stuff, but when you really read his writing, it's just so skewed. But anyways, I'm not a big like firm believer in the like insane complex of childhood into adulthood that he kind of bases, you know, roots everything out of. And then there's like repression and superstition and the doubles and stuff like that. So that's my like first thoughts.
Gotcha. That's more like it. Anybody else want to hold forth? Okay. I mean, I teach Freud a lot, but not because I like him. I teach him because he's important. You know, he's everywhere. I've taken a deep dive into Freud, and I teach a recurring seminar on his works, like a survey, and that class is very popular. And I did that mostly for myself, and I've learned a lot. And I have to say that I've started to appreciate a lot of what he has to say. But you know, Babette was speaking truth. There are a lot of gender issues with Freud, and yet, remarkably, some of my feminist colleagues are his biggest defenders. I don't know what that's all about. But you know, clinically speaking, Freud is largely not as relevant as he used to be, which is to say, you know, clinical psychiatrists, psychologists, they don't take his theories quite as seriously. That's not to say his impact hasn't been felt. It very much has. His method, he had a very specific method, which you all know because if we've ever seen The New Yorker and its cartoons, there's always a New Yorker cartoon about a guy on a couch and Freud behind listening, you know, stream of consciousness, blah, 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 plumbing the depths of subconscious. We know this is all like second nature for us now, right? So Freud is important because of the cultural perch it has. But his account of like the childhood source of neuroses and the way repression works, yeah, a lot of clinical psychiatrists don't take that theory seriously anymore, and psychoanalysis is not nearly as popular here as it is in Europe, for example. In America, we like to take pills if we're unhappy. So Freud is too long. Freudian psychoanalysis, if you do the full cycle, it takes 7 years. You meet several times a week. People don't have time for that shit, right? In America, we got Netflix to watch. So we pop our Prozac and we get on with things. Freud called his the talking cure. And indeed, you were supposed to talk. Oh, and Freud said, famously, he wasn't going to cure you. He was honest. He just said, I'm going to deliver you to the everyday neurosis of normal people. Yippee. Any case, there's a variety of reasons he has fallen out of favor with the medical field, which would disappoint him. He was trained as a medical doctor. However, already in his own lifetime, he thought that psychoanalysis was such a momentous theory that it could be applied across the spectrum to a host of fields. He uses psychoanalysis to analyze religion. He applies it to Darwinian evolution in Totem and Taboo. In Civilization Discontents, he uses it to talk about the origins of capitalism and the motivations for war and art, right? He talks, the two essays I gave to you today are about the psychic implications of artistic creativity. He focuses mostly on fiction, but I think they can apply more broadly. Anybody have any general comments or questions about Freud? So Freud was, someone would say something?
I was just going to say, I think something to always be in consideration of with Freud is also Jung and his work, because they were in constant kind of competition with one another. And there's a history of ideas being shared and contested between the two of them. And Jung is definitely much more associated with dream states, myth making, storytelling, cosmos, kind of archetypal character manifestations inside people. So it was like one of the reasons why when he was kind of saying, diving into this topic in general of like creative kind of activity within people, I would just point towards the work that Jung was doing, which to me is much, much more associated with kind of creative making and thinking and believing.
Good to know. I'll keep that in mind for the next time I teach this. I tried to do a deep dive into Jung and I did not get far. Didn't find that too appealing. By the way, he only mentions Jung once in all his writings. So there I think he's not happy. Jung was his student initially, and he wasn't happy that Jung went on his own way. Freud is pretty egotistical, frankly. He's proud, and he doesn't like that, he doesn't like that people disagree with him, especially his own students, which happened almost immediately, right? Good. So initially, I also was not inclined to include Freud in this class but then my colleague Mikita, she's a writer in the Humanistic Studies department. She's actually a trained psychoanalyst, and she persuaded me to include this text because I think it's good for two reasons. The first overarching reason is it's kind of hard to do a class in 20th century aesthetics and not talk about Freud. We have to talk about psychoanalysis, love it or hate it. It is just very important. It's consequential. That's the word. That said, so if anything, what we will accomplish in this class and the next one where we deal with Freud is, we're going to come to grips with psychoanalytic theory and what that means for aesthetics. The other reason I think this essay is interesting is the way Freud positions it in the history of the philosophy of art. He opens it up here saying that, reminding us that aesthetics, as the term, this is as the Greeks understood it. Aesthetics is a theory of the qualities of feeling. That's aesthesis in Greek. It has to do with sensation and feeling. And indeed, throughout the history of the philosophy of art, when philosophers talk about beauty, they talked about it as a feeling. That's certainly how Kant does. And then Kant adds this issue of the sublime is a feeling, right? He's basically referencing Kant here. We're going to be talking a lot about the sublime going forward, at least, at least in the work of Lyotard, this will be important. So I'm going to say a few words about the sublime. Actually, I'm going to see what you all know about the sublime. Does anybody here know what the sublime in aesthetics, what the sublime means?
I think it's like the sensation of like awe. And I kind of connect that to like this like feeling of like greatness, that's like unity, or like it's this quality that's like bigger than yourself, or like kind of beyond yourself. You can't like quite understand it, but you get these like flashes of kind of being able to sense the like largeness of the universe in a way.
Awesome. Anybody else? What do you know about the sublime? It's so Rosemary captured a lot. It's easiest to understand the sublime as distinct from the beautiful. And Kant says we attribute beauty, as we saw, to form, and also the perception of, as Kant puts it, purposiveness without purpose, i.e., perceived design with no recognition of utility or function. So the famous example that I was giving to illustrate Kant's aesthetics is this phrase, "This rose is beautiful." And in last time we talked about this, we were speaking about, the subjective universality of this phrase. Aesthetic statements are subjectively universal. But the other point of this example is that a rose is beautiful because it conveys purposiveness without purpose, right? Or I should say design without function, or certainly in the age of Kant, before botany takes off as a field, you saw this exquisite rose. You saw this rose with exquisite detail and design, and for no obvious purpose that you could imagine or think of. Nowadays, botanists will tell us, it's described this way to attract pollinators, blah, blah, blah. But Kant's point is basically he understands aesthetic, the beautiful, as like, this is like a secular, it's almost like a secularized theology, right? You're recognizing design in the universe or designed things without overtly invoking the divine or the designer, right? The sublime, by contrast, is formless. Typically, it is so big that you cannot see purpose or design. It overwhelms cognition. So some examples he gives: the ocean. Standing on the beach, looking at the ocean on a gray day, no one else is on the beach with you. It exceeds your line of vision, and you are puny in front of it. He gives the example of giant overhanging rocks, or sitting on the beach and looking at a squall or a storm out at sea, right? So you see things that are extremely powerful and have the power to crush you, but you are removed, okay? Very importantly, though, he says the sublime is not a sense of fear. It is a positive emotion. It has a positive moral effect on you. And he understands it this way. You recognize your mortality. There's something liberating and soothing when you recognize that you are but a tiny little piece in this universe and your concerns are fleeting, right? The overarching point, which Freud mentions here at the opening, is he says, to date, aesthetics has only dealt with positive sensations, right? Beauty and the sublime are positive, but he says they don't deal with the opposite. So he says, this is why I'm going to talk about the uncanny. It belongs to all that is terrible. It arouses dread and creeping horror. The beautiful and the sublime are life affirming. They make you feel you're part of something bigger, a designed universe where your own little concerns are not overwhelming. He says traditional aesthetics doesn't deal with the opposite feelings of unpleasantness and repulsion, which is what he's going to do. So thank you, Freud. Always making contributions.
Keeping his clients coming to his front door.
Keep in mind, my colleague, Makita, who recommended this, she teaches a class on horror film. She loves horror movies, and I do not. So maybe that's why she likes this so much. We'll see. I thought the ending was very interesting, where he goes with this. So in any case, let's talk about the uncanny. How does he go about defining the uncanny?
The part I got was like that in German there's like a word for like the positive and negative version of uncanny, and to understand the positive version you first have to understand the negative version.
Okay. Awesome. Anybody else?
And that's like the feeling of like seeing something familiar that's like just slightly off enough for it to be uncomfortable.
Good.
He says like it's something that was known, then was repressed, and then you're re-engaged with it, or it kind of returns to you, is what he says. So like known, repressed, and then returned.
Good. Yeah, as Blythe was revealing, he's very interested in the etymology of this term. So the German is unheimlich. And he points out that, well, I'll turn it over to you guys. What does he point out about the etymology of this term? This is uncanny, the unheimlich. Its root word is heimlich. You can hear homely in there, right? You can hear that. What does he end up pointing out about the etymology, about these two terms here? Anybody get what he was trying to say?
A little bit like the idea that Heimlich is kind of like home in some ways, maybe, or am I wrong about that? But the idea of like returning to home, or the inability to return to that.
Good. That's part of it. One step further.
Well, it kind of like he says that like Heimlich and unheimlich. I don't know. Sorry. I can speak German. That they're kind of like, it kind of reminded me of Heidegger, where it's like one, like the truth is the same as not truth, or like they
Yeah.
kind of, like go together. So I can't really explain it, but that's kind of what it reminded me of.
That's actually what he says in the end. He says Heimlich has two meanings. One meaning is the exact opposite of unheimlich, and the other is the same. That's kind of fucked up. And his clue, I got all excited because I took 2 years of German in college. So this brought back some, I actually enjoyed speaking German. It's a fun language to speak. There's a lot of spitting. Anyway, there is a word in German called geheim, and geheim means secret. And you'll notice it has the same root in there, heim. So heimlich can mean familiar. This is weird. Heimlich can also mean withdrawn. And on that latter point, that's where there's overlap with the uncanny. Sorry, specifically, Heimlich can mean also withdrawn from knowledge or unconscious. Or this is a quote on page 4, that which is inaccessible to knowledge, right? Very strange. So that there's this tension inside the familiar, that what is familiar escapes familiarity.
It's like when you see all of those like photos of like liminal spaces, like these empty buildings that seem familiar because you've probably seen them filled with people, or like they're very like reminiscent of what it was like growing up in the 90s as an American. And like they're familiar, but when they're taken in this weird context, like completely empty with like stark fluorescent lighting, they become like uncanny and odd.
I love it. I was also thinking about this photographer. I saw his work. He was very close up of certain very familiar things, and you didn't know what they were, and they looked crazy. And then underneath it said dish towel, or carpet, or God forbid, yeah. So good. Yes, I think that's great. Heimlich, he says, ultimately it means something that is hidden and dangerous, such that it comes to have the same meaning ascribed to the unheimlich. Curious. Etymology is fascinating, actually. It's always highly revelatory. The one thing he doesn't do, and I did not prepare, I'm very sorry. I don't know where the hell that word uncanny comes from in English. That's a weird word. It's clearly not Germanic, because if it were, it would sound like unheimlich. So I don't know. I'll have to get to the bottom of that. And I don't think it's romance either. Good. All right. As to the events, persons, or situations that arouse a feeling of the uncanny, what all does he mention? What are the kinds of things that arouse the experience of the uncanny? Examples that he gives.
Off topic, but I just Googled it, and apparently uncanny comes from like the like Scots or Scottish word for like canny associated with the supernatural, and then just Northern English adding the on.
Interesting. It's from Scottish. It's Gaelic.
Yeah, it says like the occult too.
But is it a Gaelic word?
I think probably like fear is related to uncanny, because what he said in the article is like the unknown things, which like in the infant period that they trying to understand. So it is a resource of where the fears come or the beliefs come, something like that. So the fear and the uh, wait a minute, the subconsciousness is like related to uncanny. I don't know.
Good. Well, hang on there. We'll get there. But to work our way there, let's go through some examples of the things he gives. So what are some examples of things, or that can arouse a sense of the uncanny in us? What kind of examples does he mention?
Is the crocodile as an example of what you're asking?
The crocodile?
Yeah.
Let's see, what page is that on? I don't remember a crocodile.
It's like they put a like crocodile to a family and they smell something or
Oh, wow. I forgot about that one. All right.
There's like the example where you see a number and then you start to see the number everywhere else.
Right.
Like kind of half superstition or half like kind of, I think that's when he's starting to talk about the idea of doubling, like you start to see yourself, someone, you talk about someone and then you see that someone later, or, just the, what you start to like see things you wouldn't otherwise see. Yeah, I don't know.
Good. Early on, he mentions dolls and automatons and epilepsy. It's a little cray-cray. And this is where this will become important to us, which we arrive at the end. There's a long way getting there, but he mentions that there, as an artistic technique, you can induce a sense of the uncanny in the audience. Early on, one way he says that you do this is that you leave unknown if the narrator or main figure is human. He does give an example early on, this very long fictional account, this very long summary about the Sandman. This was a particularly fucked up story if you paid attention to it. So I was curious, anybody want to tell us about the Sandman and how this illustrates the uncanny? And I don't think you should tell this story to your children. Ever. Jay is putting Babette on the spot. That's mean. What is uncanny about the Sandman?
Well, I feel like he like takes the form of a couple different characters in his life, and and then eventually comes back to it, like kind of haunts him a little bit. The main character.
It recurs. Something familiar recurs.
Yeah, and then like all these characters were in fact the same person.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. What else?
Well, that's where he introduces the castration complex.
Yeah.
Which is our like greatest fear of castration. in particularly with the eyes. And so there's this, like, as a childhood story being told about this creature thing, and then, you know, basically leading all the way to adult life, and this fear of like the eye and the sight being taken from someone, is uncanny in this, like, slowly what he had convinced himself was a fairy tale or a story starts to blur into real life, and it starts to kind of unravel for this character that perhaps it is real and it's not a fairy tale, and that kind of loss of clarity there.
Good, yeah. There's also the issue of Olympia, this figure Olympia, who he falls in love with, who is an automaton, but lifelike, and then apparently eyeless. This sounds like a nightmare. Has no eyes. And to what Rosemary was saying, this figure Coppelius keeps recurring in Italian Coppola. Right. So this is an illustration of an uncanny story. Right. And it features the castration complex, Babette points out. I will be honest with you, I've never really understood the castration complex, even though I taught Freud forever. Maybe it's just because I don't buy it. But regardless, he points out when you talk about eyes and you talk about taking someone's eyes away, this is a point of overlap between Freud and Jung, even though he'll never admit it, right? Freud always invokes the story of Oedipus Rex. Why? It's more than just a story, right? It is a cultural, it's a myth that transmits something about our psychic nature, you know. And Oedipus, obviously, he takes out his eyes, right? It's also where we get the word Oedipal complex, by the way, right? Because Oedipus married his mother and killed his father, and Freud calls the desire to do what he did. He calls that the nexus of all neuroses. We must overcome that complex. For women, it is reversed. It's called the Electra complex. You wish to marry your father and kill your mother. Fear of castration is something that boys uniquely suffer, according to Freud.
And that women suffer because they yearn to have what the boys have.
They envy the penis. This is where Freud was so stupid. I don't get it. Like, why would you envy that? But regardless, I'm just the delivery man. The point he says that a boy's relationship to his father, he says, is one of ambivalence. Actually, both children, but especially the boy. What he means by ambivalence is that the boy both loves and fears the father because he sees in the father the threat of castration. Okay? So there's already some element of the uncanny there, right? The father figure is the most familiar, and it's fearsome as well, right? There's reason to fear that father. It's the ultimate threat comes from the most familiar in that point. As to dolls, he says something compelling. And, you know, he's not always wrong. He says something here about dolls that actually, I got to teach Freud as my kids were young growing up. So I got to see like case study. And I hate to say it, but he's not entirely wrong about everything he says about little kids. I like to think he's wrong about the castration complex because I have 3 boys and I would hate to think they think that of me. But about dolls, he says that children have no sharp distinction between living and lifeless objects. Children have no sharp distinction between living and lifeless objects. They will treat their dolls like real people. And indeed, my daughter had a doll she took everywhere. And when we went to a restaurant, the doll had to have a seat, you know. And I had to address her and her doll. So what's also curious about the uncanny is that we, you know, if lifelike dolls are an aspect of the uncanny, and immediately I think of Blade Runner. Anybody? Blade Runner? Me and the grad students are thumbs up. The undergrads are like, what? Blade Runner, one of the top 5 movies all time. Harrison Ford. With God, it's been so long. Replicants, they were called. They were essentially, Daryl Hannah, they were supposed to be creations and not real humans, right? We don't necessarily fear lifelike dolls. We may desire it in a way because our original relation to the lifelike dolls was one where we treated them as friends or companions, right? So a source of the uncanny feeling is not an infantile fear necessarily, but it can also be an infantile wish or belief. Oh God. Okay, Jay, duly noted. As I said, I'm not going to defend him. I'm just the reporter. Then there is the doppelganger. He also refers to this as the double. And I was reading this over and I was like, he has several pages on the doppelganger. And I'm like, okay, yeah. Then I thought, what the hell? So I have a very serious question for y'all. Have you guys encountered your doppelganger? Is this a thing?
So I haven't encountered my doppelganger, but multiple of my friends have encountered my doppelganger. And I'm like, go on. Did you get a picture? Like, I swear you were at a football game. Like, do I look like I would be at a football game?
So this is a thing.
My friends from like another high school like got really confused because there was a girl like in the like class under them that looked exactly like me, but we went to different schools, but it was in like the same county. It was really weird.
Like I think there was like this theory that doppelgangers will be attracted to each other because they look so similar and like they have such similar attributes to each other. But also law of large numbers, someone's gonna look a little like you.
Seriously. The way he was describing the doppelganger is like you encounter someone looks exactly like you. It's almost like looking in a mirror. And yes, that would be messed up. I agree. To this day, I have not had that experience myself. He quotes Otto Rank. Rank was Freud had 3 twins. Yes, Jay, totally. Freud had 3 famous followers. They were Rank, Adler, and Jung. And they all went in their different directions. And he quotes Otto Rank here quite a bit. This is on page, I guess, 9 and 10, about the doppelganger. For Otto Rank, the double is connected with reflections in mirrors, with shadows, with the belief in the soul, right? The soul is your doppelganger. there's this material you and the spiritual you. Which is like your shadow, or as the Greeks called it, your daimon. Your daimon. That's what the Greeks used to refer to it, that you had an accompanying spirit. I think he even mentions that. And he says that this doppelganger was the expression of self-love or primary narcissism, which dominates the mind of the child. Early childhood, to talk about the psychic development of the child. Early on, the child is marked by narcissism. Actually, narcissism is how you overcome the complex, technically. Freud says, so according to the Oedipal complex, you love your mother and you hate your father, or reverse. And the way you overcome that is that you direct both love and hate internally. You love your ego, and then there's the erection of the superego or conscience, which we'll talk about shortly, right? So this is just 1 second about Freud 101. You have the ego, the superego, and you have the id. The superego sits in the middle. The id are the drives, the dark drives, sex and violence, that animate the ego kind of secretly. And the superego is the conscience. You could say it's the voice of society, but he points out in the book called The Ego and the Id, he points out that the superego actually channels the violent force of the id and inflicts it on the ego. So basically, the Oedipal complex is liquidated by being routed inside. So early childhood is marked by narcissism that dominates the mind of the child. And the double, this is quote on page 10, the double, which is endemic to primary narcissism of the developing ego, he says it is anathema to our conscience. Right? The conscience, this is the source of eternal tension in the psyche, according to Freud, right? You direct love towards ego, and the ego is at the same time the subject of punishment and hate from the superego. Because the violent drives of the id, they need their outlet. If they don't get their outlet, there's a problem. So it's inflicted on the ego. Here's a quote on page 10. And then I'll open up for questions or comments. 10 on the left side, he says. But it's not only this narcissism, offensive to the ego, criticizing faculty, which may be incorporated in the idea of a double. There are also those unfulfilled but possible futures to which we still like to cling in fantasy. All those strivings of the ego, which adverse external circumstances have crushed, and all our suppressed acts of volition which nourish in us the illusion of free will. This is a funny quote. So the idea of, if you ever come across your double, that is an uncanny, that's an uncanny experience on the one hand, because the superego punishes you for narcissism, okay? And yet, to live is to make choices and to have options foreclosed, right? Think of the Robert Frost poem, right? At a road, I took a choice. I made a choice. And when you make that choice, you foreclose the other choice. But what he's kind of saying here is that if you see your ego, you're like, you're doubled. You're like that. Maybe that's an occasion for fantasy too, where you think like, that's the path I did not take. So to put it, I know Jay's like, whatever. Well, it can be a variety of ways. Like if I go to a Ravens game and I see my double as the quarterback, I'm like, fuck, that's a path I could have taken. But then if I go to the gas station to fill up and the attendant looks exactly like me, I'm like, well, okay, that's a path I could have taken too. That's funny, Jay. Send a selfie to your parents. That would make them very confused. Yeah, I mean, again, the relationship to the double is ambivalent. That's the point he makes here. And then he tells us this. There's another quote here in the middle of page 10 on the right side. The quality of uncanniness can only come from the circumstance of the double being a creation dating back to a very early mental stage, long since left behind, and one, no doubt, in which it wore a more friendly aspect. The double has become a vision of terror, just as after the fall of their religion, the gods took on demonic shapes. And I'm not really sure I understand what he means by demonic here. Yeah, narcissism becomes possibly the narcissism reflected by the doppelganger possibly becomes an object of terror later on in life. He drops this point as well, which I thought was really interesting. He says that the double also harkens back to a period in ego development when the ego doesn't differentiate itself strongly from the external world. And this is something that a later student of Freud makes a lot about by the name of Lacan. He was all the rage for a while there. And then he proved kind of controversial. He talks early on, he thinks that the seminal point of psychic development in a child is this thing called the mirror stage. The mirror stage is, he describes it like this. A child initially, this is a point he gets from Freud, basically. A child initially doesn't think that there is any difference between him or her and the world. And that seems like a very strange thing to say. As Freud puts it, in the very early child, the pleasure principle rules supreme. And only slowly is the reality principle introduced. And here's what that means. For the very early child, Lacan says the very early child sees no difference between him and his mother. He thinks that he and his mother are one and the same. Sounds weird, right? But he thinks that because the mother meets all his needs. He opens his mouth to cry, he's soothed. He's hungry, she feeds him. He goes to the bathroom, she cleans him. He's tired, she goes, puts him to sleep, right? You hardly have to speak, in other words, and your mother soothes you until that day, Lacan says, when the child sees himself in the mirror and he sees a line around himself and he realizes that he is an individual, differentiated being. And in a way, it's all downhill from there, right? Now you have to strive. And the process of growing up is a process whereby Freud says the reality, I'm going to put it this in the chat, growing up is a process whereby the reality principle is introduced. And what that means is that as you are introduced to reality as youth, you're introduced to pain and suffering and desire. You have to meet your own needs. Reality hurts. We shelter babies from that so they don't recognize the reality principle. Anyway, I just wanted to put that in your radar. This is an important Freudian notion, which then Lacan spins off, which is that originally we don't differentiate between ourselves and anything in the universe, right? We feel like we are one with it all, or it is all us. As Freud puts it in Civilization Discontents, he also calls this limitless narcissism. Or as Descartes would put it, it's solipsism. It's where you think that you are the only one existing. And it's all you. Let me pause there for a second, see if anybody has any questions or comments. All good? All right. Let's take the next step. He moves on then to infantile psychology and sees the experience of the uncanny rooted in a repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsion. This is on page 11. What is a repetition compulsion? Please don't say it's a compulsion to repeat.
Wasn't
Be a little more than that.
wasn't that maybe that less than the double? Wasn't that the notion of like starting to see patterns, like starting to see if you read something about a number, then all of a sudden you start seeing that number everywhere. Or it's not that you're seeing it, but you have this like compulsion to find it and like and manifest it in everything else.
Awesome. You have a vocal cat today, huh? Does your cat like Freud or not?
He's going through childhood limitless narcissism.
Yeah, the reality is you can't go outside all the time. So
Cats are such narcissists, by the way. That's why we love them. Good. Yeah, repetition compulsion. That is where he takes it, Babette. You're right. In the early stages of infantile psychology, he talks about, I'm trying to see where this, he links it to, there's a kind of compulsiveness in neurotics. Okay. He has a beautiful little essay where he writes about obsessional neurosis and religious ritual. And the title kind of sums it up, right? Essentially what he does in this essay is he says, I see a parallel between the rituals of my obsessive patients. Today we would call them obsessive compulsive patients, which is a form of neurosis for him, and religious rituals, right? When people go to mass and they do the sign of the cross and they say the rosary and they get on their knees, and they do these rituals unthinkingly. He talks about neurotic rituals as well. And the interesting point he makes in this little essay is he points out that all of us have little superstitions, right? And if we don't fulfill these superstitions, we see like something's wrong, right? I mean, here's a very important thesis you all need to understand about Freud. We're all neurotics. We're all just on the scale or a spectrum, so to speak. So some are more neurotic than others. And don't forget, like I said at the beginning, he's just going to deliver us to the everyday neurosis of humankind. I'm sorry, I see what Blythe has written here. The difference is OCD is not via choice, and due to the intrusive thought, the thought comes first, the ritual comes second. Yeah. He doesn't say it's by choice, right? Absolutely. However, he would point out that like ritual becomes almost unconscious, right? They're similarly irrational.
And to the person with OCD, the ritual seems rational because the thought that they're getting like makes them believe that doing that ritual will make that thing from not happening. For example, someone with OCD may have an intrusive thought that says like, my mom will die if I don't tap that thing 3 times, or someone will break into my house if I don't lock the door 3 times. And so to them, it seems completely rational.
Good. You put it very well. It's certainly not like functional or practical. Maybe that's a better word, you know. And we see these, you know, for you to understand what he's talking about here, just think about the ordinary superstitions that all of us may have, right? I, for example, will not walk under a ladder. I just won't do it. I have a PhD. I know better. I still won't do it. You know, we all have these little superstitions. Hopefully you do as well. Then you feel like you have to do them if you're not going to get bad luck or whatever. What Freud ends up noticing in this essay on obsessional neurosis and religious ritual, he says that it's essentially in both cases, it is these, you know, the OCD action and the religious ritual are both attempts to expiate guilt, whether you acknowledge it or not. They're a form of preemptive punishment in a way. Like I have to do this. I have to make myself suffer in this way in order to overcome, you know, desires or temptations. It's a punishment for yourself in a way. So repetition compulsion is something we absolutely see in neurotics and in neurosis more broadly. And consider, this is what Freud says about on page 12. I'm calling your attention to this passage. This is very bottom on the left side. He says, as a matter of fact, is this the one? He had no difficulty in producing coincidences of this sort, but then not only he, but all obsessional neurotics, there you go, I've observed are able to relate analogous experiences. They are never surprised when they invariably run up against the person they have just been thinking of. Perhaps for the first time for many months, if they say one day, I haven't had any news of so-and-so for a long time, they'll be sure to get a letter from him the next morning. And an accident or a death will rarely take place without having cast its shadow before on their minds. They are in the habit of mentioning the state of affairs in the most modest manner, saying that they have presentiments which usually come true. So again, deep relation to superstition here, right? If I say it, it will happen. The feeling that he produces coincidences. Right, and following the train of thought that Babette was pointing to, later on this page, he talks about the omnipotence of thoughts, or as he refers to a kind of animism that reigns supreme in young children. This is again reaching for Freud. Babette said it earlier. It's all about childhood. It's all about childhood. Infantile psychology is the mother lode. It's the source of everything. And when we were children, we thought our thoughts were omnipotent, that they had power on the world outside us. Why? Because when you were a baby, you thought you were hungry and mama pushed a bottle in your mouth. When you thought you were tired and mama put you to bed. And also this idea of animism. I love his use of the word animism. I will say this. Freud may get a lot wrong. He may be one of the best writers that I've ever come across. This is not even his best writing. This is far from it. But just the idea of using the word animism here is so evocative. Animism today is referred to kind of religions that see spirits in nature, right? And when he talks about children being animists, this is crazy, and it's very powerful, but it's right. You know, children, you know, they see living spirits everywhere. They see animals and trees as, you know, as inspirited things. Jay, what are you talking about in the quote in the chat? The thing about mentioning things and they come true. Modern spiritual manifestation.
So there's this practice where people it's part of a spiritual practice where if you do a ritual and think about it and live as though it has happened, or like continue to do it and continue to mention it, it'll come true. Like, oh, if I think about money and spend money and like go towards this thing, then I'll get money.
Yeah.
Yeah, astrology is a huge thing too. It's like, oh, wear red and you'll have good luck, and you notice all the good things that happen, or wear like green and you'll have bad luck, and it's like, oh no, I'm wearing a green clip, and then things start happening. It's like, I've cursed myself, that kind of thing.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I mean, one of his recurring themes is that we never really shed this juvenile superstition. We never really shed our infantile animism. And I'll give you an example to prove it. Have you ever like stubbed your toe in a chair and cursed the chair? Have you ever like been hit by a tree branch and cursed the tree branch? Right? Maybe you were even inspired to curse God and like, don't fuck with me today. Maybe I'm revealing too much about myself here, but you know, you ever cursed a thing like the thing had anything to do with it? I never get so angry as when I curse the thing and my wife says to me, now, why'd you curse that thing? You know, and I'm like, I fucking know that. Would you please just let me be angry? Like, I don't want to. This is not a moment I want to be rational, please. Anyway. Yeah, he talks about the old animistic conception of the universe, or the narcissistic overestimation of subjective mental processes. It's on page 12, where we basically feel that our mental processes have an effect on the world around us. And basically the uncanny stirs vestiges of this animistic state. And so he gives that example of the guy who goes to I think he goes to the spa and he wants to get his bed, right? It's on page 12. And his room is taken. He says, well, I hope the old guy has a stroke and dies. And then he dies, right? And you're like, and that guy feels like, oh my God, what have I done? Good. Good summary here on page 14. He summarizes the objects, these occasions that give rise to the uncanny. He says, middle left of the page, we have now only a few more remarks to add for animism, magic, and witchcraft. The omnipotence of thoughts, man's attitude to death, involuntary repetition, and the castration complex comprise practically all the factors which turn something fearful into an uncanny thing. We've dealt with most of these, but not all of them. Should we talk about death? Does anyone want to talk about death? When, how or when is death? How is death an uncanny?
I guess like the sensation of understanding that like you knew that person in every single detail of their lives and now they no longer exist, and the fact that like that familiarity is like gone somewhere that you cannot go.
Good. That's great. Can anybody think of anything uncanny maybe when they saw a dead body?
Oh, I'm still unmuted. So there are multiple accounts where, like, technically I haven't done it, but I listen to too many murder like podcasts, and something that happens is that a jogger, a run, like someone who is just driving by thinks, "Oh, that's a weird place to leave a mannequin."
Oh,
Like there was this kid who walked past a body and he's like, "Yeah, I just thought it was a mannequin on like that person's like lawn or like this place." And then the runner later, like an adult runner comes by, is like, "Yeah, I thought it was a mannequin," and then it ended up being a murder victim.
wow. Okay. I'm thinking of like, go ahead, Babette.
I was gonna say I found a dead body once, and it was uncanny in the sense that you first think, at first I thought it was sleeping, the body.
Yeah.
It's very familiar. It's like, oh, it's a body laying there.
Yeah.
And then there's like a stillness to it that's a different level of stillness. So it's like extremely known and unknown at the same time. I don't know.
I was also thinking of like, if you ever seen a dead body of a loved one, like in a funeral home, something highly familiar and yet deeply unfamiliar at that moment.
It's like removing the context of the person that you know when they're in like a funeral situation, because they're not surrounded by like the things and objects and place and smell that you usually associate with them.
That's great. Yeah, totally. I think he also means to say, though, that the experience of death is also uncanny. In that death is, in a way, highly familiar to us, of course, and then totally alien at the same time. Right, the eternal sleep.
Yeah, like this may be a reach, but I'm thinking about how like death can be considered like cyclical, and like if we take it back like to when we are born and like that very first like experience of being birthed, and like what like I'm just thinking about his referral to like being a child so often, and with death I'm thinking about like the experience right before being birthed, and how maybe there's like an uncanniness in that like those quick moments right before.
Good. Yeah, he does talk about being buried alive is uncanny because it is evocative of being in the womb. What the hell? Okay. But something has occurred to me, Kat, while you were talking. And what I want to say is, just so you know, I'm not a pervert, okay? I'm trying to channel Freud here. So perversion is going to happen. But desire, you might say, is also something that we death is something that we curiously desire in a way as well. We do and we don't. When Jay points out it's the eternal sleep, there's some kind of rest there. Now, I'm going to tell you something that I don't understand. People have often explained to me this is very momentous and significant, and I still don't get it. But in French, the orgasm is called la petite mort, the little death. I don't get it. I don't want to get into details. I have children. I have requisite experience. I still don't get why it's little death. I don't get it. So I don't want to talk about it. I'm Catholic. I don't want to talk about these things. So think about it on your own time. Come to your own conclusions. But there is something about death. It's a similarly ambivalent object that we desire and dread at the same time. Got it? All right. Do what you will with that. I washed my hands. Let's talk about one more thing, and then I think we're probably gonna, actually, you know what? I think in the interest of time, the last section here is really, I think the most interesting part, where he talks about, he says, listen, there's a problem of the uncanny. And the problem of the uncanny has to do with not how we encounter it, but how artists create it. And this is where he says, he says on page 16, he points out, like, fairy tales employ a lot of the stuff we're talking about here. And they're not uncanny. So this is where this is really where he turns to talk about the artistic creation of the uncanny. And I think I'm going to leave it here so that we can pick that up with our next meeting. Okay. Because I think we had a good conversation today. I don't want to burn you out, so I'm going to let you go. Okay. I will stick around if anybody wants to chat. So I won't see you for 2 weeks now. Okay. Get some rest. You have your papers due in 2 weeks. No reading assignment at that point. Feel free to get in touch with me at any point while you write these papers. Okay. I'm just hanging out. I can meet you on Zoom. I will see you in 2 weeks. Your papers will be due, but no reading assignment. We will just convene to pick up the last details of these essays by Freud. Okay. Sound good? All right. Awesome. Well, listen, have a good little break, good mini break, and I will see you in 2 weeks. And if anybody wants to chat, I'm going to stick around. Okay. Freud is a bastard. Okay. At least we've learned something today. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great break. Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
I did have a question.
Yeah.
I just was wondering.
Wait, can I ask you guys a question?
Sure.
Are you guys sisters?
Yes.
Yeah.
How the hell did I not know this?
I think we said it in the first class.
I guess I wasn't. I thought you weren't serious.
Oh no.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. Never mind. Yeah. I see it now. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could explain again why, like, how the word Heimlich is both, like, has that two different, like, with the same thing with, like, Heidegger, with the truth and the non-truth being the same thing, like, sort of get it and then I don't get it at the same time.
Simple. Heimlich means, I'm going to try and make it simpler. I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't make it very simple earlier, but I think it can be simplified this way. Heimlich, Heim in German means home. That's it. So Heimlich means homely or familiar in one respect, but it can also mean what is hidden. And originally, I think it had the term was hidden in the home, what you keep within.
Mm.
And it's out of that definition that the uncanny, that unheimlich and Heimlich mean the same thing.
Okay.
It's the familiar that is unfamiliar. It's the familiar that is hidden, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's basically it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then with Heidegger, when he's talking about, like, truth and non-truth, as being the same thing. What that might be something different, but I'm just wondering what that.
Well, what Heidegger does is he uses the Greek word aletheia, which means uncovered, or, you know, it's what is truth is an uncovering, right? And it's an exposing, you know, of what we might ignore in our everyday life, right? So the Greek temple exposes the sky by its profile, you know, that kind of a thing. So, I mean, essentially for Heidegger to understand truth as an uncovering.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah. I guess I am like remembering sections where he says like truth is